Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK's economic recovery has been quicker and stronger than forecast. In the depths of the pandemic, our economy was expected to return to its pre-crisis level at the end of 2022. Instead, it got there in November 2021, a full year earlier. Unemployment was expected to peak at nearly 12%. Instead, it peaked at 5.2% and has now fallen to just over 4%, saving more than 2 million jobs. And with the fastest growing economy in the G7 this year, over 400,000 more people on payrolls than before the pandemic, and business investment rising, it is no wonder, Mr. Speaker, that borrowing is set to fall from £320 billion last year, the highest ever peacetime level, to just £46 billion by the end of this Parliament. As we emerge from the depths of the worst recession in 300 years, we should be proud of our economic record. The economy is stronger because of the plan we put in place, because of the actions we took to protect families and businesses, and that plan is working. But for all the progress we are making, the job is not yet done. Right now, I know that the #1 issue on people's minds is the rising cost of living. It is the Independent Bank of England's role to deliver low and stable inflation, and the Governor will set out their judgments at midday today. And just as the government stood behind the British people through the pandemic, so we will help people deal with one of the biggest costs they now face: energy. The energy regulator, Ofgem, announced this morning that the energy price cap will rise in April to £1,971, an increase of £693 for the average household. Without government action, this would be incredibly tough for millions of hard-working families. So the government is going to step in to directly help people manage those extra costs. Mr. Speaker, before I set out the steps we are taking, let me explain what is happening to energy prices and why. People's energy bills are rising because it is more expensive for companies who supply our energy to buy oil, coal and gas. Of the £693 increase in the April price cap, around 80% comes from wholesale energy prices. Over the last year, the price of gas alone has quadrupled. And because over 85% of homes in Britain are heated with a gas boiler, and around 40% of our electricity comes from gas, this is hitting households hard. Now, the reason gas prices are soaring are global. Across Europe and Asia, a long cold winter last year depleted gas stores. Disruption to other energy sources like nuclear and wind left us relying more than usual on gas during the summer months. Surging demand in the world's manufacturing centres in Asia, at the same time as countries like China are moving away from coal, is further increasing demand for gas. And concerns about a possible Russian incursion into Ukraine are putting further pressure on wholesale gas markets. And so, prices are rising. Mr. Speaker, the price cap has meant that the impact of soaring gas prices has so far fallen predominantly on energy companies, so much so that some suppliers who couldn't afford to meet those extra costs have gone out of business as a result. It is not sustainable to keep holding the price of energy artificially low. For me to stand here and pretend we don't have to adjust to paying higher prices would be wrong and dishonest. But what we can do is take the sting out of a significant price shock for millions of families by making sure the increase in prices is smaller initially and spread over a longer period. Mr. Speaker, without government intervention, the increase in the price cap would leave the average household having to find an extra £693. The actions I'm announcing today will provide to the vast majority of households just over half of that amount, £350. In total, the government is going to help around 28 million households this year. Taken together, this is a plan to help with the cost of living worth around £9 billion. We are delivering that support in 3 different ways. First, we will spread the worst of the extra costs of this year's energy price shock over time. This year, all domestic electricity customers will receive an upfront discount on their bills worth £200. Energy suppliers will apply the discount on people's bills from October, with the government meeting the cost in full. That discount will automatically be repaid from people's bills in equal £40 instalments over the next 5 years. This is the right way to support people while staying on track with our plans to repair the public finances. And because we are taking a fiscally responsible approach, we can also provide more help faster to those who need it most, the second part of our plan. We're going to give people a £150 council tax rebate to help with the cost of energy in April, and this discount won't need to be repaid. And I do want to be clear with the House that we are deliberately not just giving support to people on benefits. Lots of people on middle incomes are struggling right now too. So we have decided to provide the council tax rebate to households in bands A to D. This means around 80% of all homes in England will benefit. And the third part of our plan will provide local authorities with a discretionary fund of nearly £150 million to help those lower income households who happen to live in higher council tax properties and households in bands A to D who are exempt from council tax at all. We're also confirming today that we'll go ahead with existing plans to expand eligibility for the Warm Homes discount by almost a third, so that 3 million vulnerable households will now benefit from that scheme. And that's not all we're doing to help vulnerable households. We're providing £3 billion over this Parliament to help more than 500,000 lower-income homes become more energy efficient, saving them on average £290 a year, increasing the national living wage to £9.50 an hour in April, a rise of over £1,000 for 2 million low-paid workers. And we're providing an effective tax cut for those on universal credit, allowing almost 2 million households to keep an average of £1,000 per year. The payment through energy suppliers will apply across England, Wales and Scotland. Energy policy is devolved in Northern Ireland with a different regulator, and the government does not have the legal powers to intervene. But we will make sure the executive is funded to do something similar, with around £150 million for Northern Ireland through the Barnett formula next year. And because the council tax system is England only, total Barnett consequentials of around £565 million will be provided to the devolved administrations in the usual way. Mr. Speaker, I know that some in this House have argued for a VAT cut on energy. However, that policy would disproportionately benefit wealthier households. There would be no guarantee that suppliers would pass on the discounts to all customers, and we should be honest with ourselves. This would become a permanent government subsidy on everyone's bills, a permanent subsidy worth £2.5 billion every year at a time when we are trying to rebuild the public finances. Instead, our plan allows us to provide more generous support faster to those who need it most, providing 28 million households with at least £200 and the vast majority receiving £350. It is fair, it is targeted, it is proportionate. It is the right way to help people with a spike in energy costs. Mr. Speaker, today's announcements are just one part of the government's plan to tackle this country's most pressing economic challenges. A plan for growth, with record investment in infrastructure, innovation and skills. A plan to restore the public finances, with debt falling by the end of this Parliament. A plan to cut waiting lists and back the NHS with £29 billion over 3 years and a permanent new source of funding. And, with the measures I've announced today, a plan to help with the rising cost of energy, with £350 more in the pockets of tens of millions of hard-working families. That's our plan to build a stronger economy, not just today, but for the long term, and I commend it to this House.
I now call the Shadow Chancellor, Rachel Reeves. Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the Chancellor for his statement? We have known that this price rise was coming for months, and today we learn that the energy price cap will increase to £1,971 in April. In October, I called on the government to provide immediate support for households, cutting VAT on their energy bills and saving £200 off bills, with £400 in extra targeted support for those who need it most, which would mean for some of the poorest families in our country almost no increase in energy bills from April. The government have not done that today. Now, we all remember when the Prime Minister said that cutting VAT was one of the benefits of Brexit. He said, and I quote, "When we vote leave, we will be able to scrap this unfair and damaging tax." Could there ever be a time where this policy is more needed than it is today? And I would have thought that the Prime Minister, with his unblemished record of integrity, would defend the commitments that he has made. But instead, it's another pledge thrown onto the bonfire of broken Tory promises. And the uncomfortable truth for the Chancellor is that even after what he has announced today, families in Britain will be still paying hundreds of pounds more for their energy, including some of the poorest families, from April as a result of the breathtaking rise in energy prices just announced by Ofgem. Millions of people cutting back to pay the bills. Citizens' Advice have said that they have seen a record number of people in January struggling with fuel debts before the energy price increase. But what does the government offer? A buy now, pay later scheme that loads up costs for tomorrow. High prices as far as the eye can see. This year, next year and the year after that. Give with one hand now and take it all back later. The party opposite used to talk about the nation's credit card. Well, today, Mr Speaker, we've seen the Chancellor force British households to load up their credit cards. By lending billions of pounds to energy companies, the Chancellor is gambling that prices are going to fall. But they could go up further in October. What then? Billions more loaded onto people's bills? The best way of targeting support to those who need it most would be an increase to £400 and an extension to 9 million households of the Warm Homes discount, as Labour have proposed. Their scheme today is a pale imitation of Labour's, especially for the households and pensioners on the most modest incomes. The Chancellor instead is using council tax to target extra help. That will mean many of the poorest households will not get extra support, while some of the richest do. And it's people living in the North and the Midlands who will lose out most. The hypocrisy the day after the government's levelling up white paper is obvious.
Order. Mr Holden, I think we need to be a little calmer. I'm sure you'll want to catch my eye, and it's not the way to do so. Chancellor Rachel Reid.
So can the Chancellor confirm how many people who are fuel poor will miss out on council tax support compared to the Warm Homes discount support that Labour have announced? Mr Speaker, the government had a choice. Only today, Shell announced that their profits had quadrupled to $20 billion. They described their results as momentous. Dividends up, profits up, and people's energy bills up too. Labour's plan would impose a one-off windfall tax on those excess profits. But this Chancellor would rather shield the oil and gas producers, while at the same time loading the cost onto working people and pensioners. Cabinet ministers have described the oil and gas producers as struggling. Struggling, Mr Speaker. Tell that to the 1 in 5 people who are already skipping meals so that they can pay their energy bills. And, Mr Speaker, this energy crisis has not happened overnight. It's a decade of dither and delay from the party opposite that has brought us to this point. A decade of failure to regulate our energy market. A decade in which they have slashed our gas storage capacity, leaving us more reliant than ever on Russia for our gas imports. A decade of failure to make the most of solar, tidal and wind energy. And a decade of stalled progress on insulating our homes to keep bills low, not just for 1 year, but into the future too. It has been the Tory decade that has led to this announcement, Mr Speaker, of the biggest increase in the price of domestic energy since records began. That is what the Chancellor should acknowledge and should apologise for today. The Conservatives aren't solving the cost of living crisis because the Conservative Party are the cost of living crisis.
Mr Speaker, the opposition may have some sound bites, but they certainly don't have a policy. In contrast, this government has announced measures.
Mr Seeley, is there something wrong with that wood you keep knocking? Because I think it's in good order. You don't need to test for woodworm. Chancellor of the Exchequer.
In contrast, Mr Speaker, this government has announced measures to share the burden with consumers and help manage the global price rise. And despite the faux outrage from the benches opposite, I'm sure that even they would admit privately, Mr Speaker, the support just announced is both generous and comprehensive. Let me take some of the honourable lady's points in turn, Mr Speaker. Well, first of all, on the topic of VAT, can I say, Mr Speaker, how very welcome it is that the opposition are recognising the benefits of Brexit. I hope they will join me in celebrating the fact that we have been able to change mass migration to this country after decades, that we can create new free ports in places like Teesside, that we can sign new free trade deals, and we can deregulate our economy to drive faster growth. She talked about VAT, Mr Speaker. VAT on average would be worth £90 to every household. What we are doing is providing £150 to those households who really need it and delivering that support quicker, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the honourable lady also tried to claim that it was the government's responsibility to manage global gas prices. It is very clear, and any person sensibly looking at this will acknowledge, that what is causing the increase in gas prices are global factors, as I outlined in my statement. No British government, no British Chancellor can change what is happening in Asia, or indeed can stop a nuclear power plant from going offline in Germany. And she should acknowledge that. Even in places like Norway, electricity bills are rising because these are global factors at play, which she would do well to acknowledge. And I know the right honourable gentleman sitting next to her will know that, having spent a lot of time on this. Thirdly, Mr Speaker, I do want to address this point about our support for the most vulnerable, because I am proud of this government's record in supporting those who need our help. The policies that we have announced today are progressive in their nature. A flat rate will, of course, mean far more to those on lower incomes or with lower energy bills. It is worth 5 times as much as a percentage of income for those in the lowest incomes as those on the highest incomes. And she talked about insulation. We are spending over this Parliament £3 billion to improve the energy efficiency and insulation of over 500,000 households in fuel poverty, Mr Speaker. That is the right thing to do, and it will save those vulnerable families, on average, £300 a year, not just this year, but every year going forward. And we have already announced those plans, Mr Speaker. And lastly, to address her point on windfall taxes, and of course, they sound superficially appealing, Mr Speaker, but we on this side of the House deal with complex problems in a responsible way. Now, the obvious impact of a windfall tax would be, Mr Speaker, to deter investment. It's as simple as that. And at this moment, I want to see more investment in the North Sea, not less. Last year, Mr Speaker, we saw the lowest amount of investment on record in the North Sea, as my honourable friend pointed out just the other day. And there are billions of pounds, £11 billion of projects lined up to go. I want to unlock that investment because that is good for this country. It is good for British jobs, Mr Speaker, and it is good for our energy security. So, Mr Speaker, we will pursue policies that are good for the interests of this country, not just today, but in the future. And I know that my right honourable friend, the Energy Secretary, is working very hard to make sure that we have an energy market that is fit for the future. We have made investments in nuclear, which, as he rightly pointed out, investments in nuclear that were ignored by the party opposite when they were in power, that we are now fixing. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I am not blind to the challenges that we face. I have to say, though, to the honourable member opposite and her colleagues, we on this side of the House did not have the luxury of sitting on the sidelines and throwing stones. Faced with the gravest of crises, this government chose to protect millions of jobs. It chose to support millions of businesses. It chose to invest in a world-leading vaccination programme. And it chose a balanced approach to COVID so we could open up faster than anywhere else in Europe, Mr. Speaker. We did these things at record speed at a time of great uncertainty. And we will always strive to learn from mistakes. Nothing is ever perfect when responding to a crisis. But I'd say to the party opposite, there is a fine line between reasonable criticism and political opportunism. And in my experience, Mr. Speaker, the British people can always tell the difference.